Welcome to the Contagious Code Podcast, where we dive deep into code, learn practical skills, celebrate the beauty of engineering, and eliminate imposter syndrome. I'm Tejas Kumar, and I've been building on the web for over 20 years at places like Vercel, Spotify, Zeta, and many more. Today on the podcast, we're launching Sentry Week with my guest, David Cramer, the founder of Sentry. Sentry is a way to monitor your application and increase its performance by observing its performance in front of all of your users. With Sentry, it can capture exceptions and loading times and present them to you in a really great dashboard, such that you go in, you observe for 5 minutes, and you make fixes that need to be fixed. It's a really great tool that I've used for years with success, and I recommend to all of them. They don't sponsor the podcast. We don't have that kind of relationship, but I just genuinely love Sentry. And so I'm very excited about this episode. In this episode, David talks about building Sentry. Like, where did it start from scratch? It was just his open source project. He didn't think this is going to be a huge moneymaker like it is today. He didn't think this is going to service literally millions of companies and open source projects worldwide. And so we go from the entire journey, this little open source side project, to working at a company that uses it, to then building it into the global leader for monitoring and performance that it is today. It's a truly, really awesome, it's one of my favorite episodes ever, mainly because David is also just a really genuine person. He tells it like it is and highly values transparency and realness, if we can use that word. And so it's just a truly great discussion, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Now, this is very much separate to my day job, and I'd like to offer all of this to you at no cost. The way we can do that is through sponsors and partners. So let's take a moment to acknowledge them. The Contagious Code Podcast is partnered with That Conference. That Conference is a family-first, multidisciplinary tech conference that happens twice a year in Wisconsin and in Texas. If you'd like to attend any of that conferences, we give away free tickets frequently. Just share this episode on social media, say you'd like to enter a free ticket to attend the next That Conference, and that's it. You'll enter a raffle to do so. The Contagious Code Podcast is also partnered with Code Crafters. Code Crafters teaches you how to build tools that we use every day, like Git, Docker, and Redis, from scratch. So you would make your own of these tools in a programming language that you want to get better at. And by doing this, you get better at the tool itself by understanding its mechanisms and how it works. And you get better at the language by using it to build the tool. That's great. They have a generous free tier. If you want to save 40% when you start paying, then use the code in the show notes. That's tej.as/codecrafters. Finally, the Contagious Code Podcast is partnered with Stately.ai. Stately is a great way to visualize the flow of state through your application using state machines, sometimes called state charts. And so how they work is you literally model, you're like, okay, this state, and then that state, and you model the transitions between them in a diagram. Once you have this diagram, you can export it to a JavaScript or TypeScript file where you fill in the logic that transitions from one state to another, and then you've got an application. This makes the flow of state across your application predictable and deterministic, but also testable, so your applications are more robust. They also have a framework for working with large language models to create AI agents that's called Stately Agent. If you'd like to give any of this a try, go to stately.ai. Thank you so much for sticking around. Now for my discussion with David Cramer. David Cramer, thanks for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you about Sentry today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on here.
This is the Contagious Code Podcast's love affair with Sentry continues with the third person from Sentry. You are the founder of Sentry, as far as I know, is what I'm told, and I'd love to start the discussion off just with an introduction to yourself, where you've been, what you're up to these days, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I am. Founder's a complicated word. I don't actually know what it means half the time these days, but I started the Sentry project in a long time ago. It doesn't even matter. And then my co-founder helped me start the business, who runs our design function. But I've spent a very long time now working on Sentry, suffice to say. I guess a little bit about my background. So, I'm a software engineer by trade, or at least used to be. Self-taught. I grew up in the Midwest of the U.S., in Nebraska, which is a very uninteresting place. But there's also not much tech there. There's a little bit more now, which is nice. But there was zero when I lived there. And so you didn't get a lot of exposure to stuff. And, and it's also like a little bubble in the middle of nowhere. So the internet was super, super attractive, right? And I think the thing that always sticks out to me that was like special to me was sort of the accessibility of the internet, like how open it was. And even today, like random guy from Nebraska has built a fairly successful company. Yeah. And I come from like a working class family, so no advantages, I would say, really, other than maybe being a white dude or something like that. But and so that is like a very big deal to me. And I think that's like one of my passions is kind of keeping that as like accessible as possible and making sure people have access to things. It's also why we like this open source thing with the sustainability around it and all these other things. But yeah, I feel like I'm a stereotype these days. I'm like the high school, college dropout turned startup founder. I would say we're probably successful at this point. I think most people would call us a success. We still have a ways to go, to be clear. But yeah, I don't know. I've worked at a few tech companies. Got my start through gaming, actually. In that I was really into online games, like especially the early days. EverQuest, Ultima Online was just super captivating to me. And then I started reverse engineering like the item databases basically of them, particularly around World of Warcraft. And that turned into a tech career. And then one thing led to another, and that got me out to San Francisco. And, here I am.
Wow. Gaming, that's so cool. I'm actually also really into Fortnite. I just love it. I laugh because like most people's 11-year-olds play Fortnite, and here I'm at 31. But it's just, I don't know. I find it very, very interesting. Awesome. Hey, thank you for that intro. You mentioned you used to be a software engineer. What do you do now? Do you still code?
That is a very good question. It's often, I find it tricky to describe what I do. I actually write a lot of code, but it's mostly for I have this side project. I don't know why. I always want to be building something. And the lesson I've had in life is getting something off the ground is actually the most tedious and demanding part. And once you do, sort of iteration is actually really, really cheap and accessible. And so it took me a long time to actually get something going, but I had this like whiskey database effectively. I just like building databases basically. But I had this whiskey database I've been working on for a while, which is kind of a way for me to keep in tune with tech and try out new technologies. We also use it to dog food Sentry in a lot of ways, which I guess is weird, but helpful. But I don't actually work on anything of that nature for Sentry itself, other than, once a year we have a hack week and I'll build some random project, or at least attempt to build some random project. And so I would say I still write plenty of code. I think I'm still pretty competent at it, but I'm not really sure anymore. JavaScript's very confusing. But for work, I do what I would just broadly describe as like corporate strategy. And what it actually looks like is I'm mostly like heavily involved with sort of the subjective nature of what we build from a product point of view, the subjective nature of how we structure the business, of how we package and sell our product. So I'm not so much involved in like the implementation. I'm just involved in like the round table of loud opinions on like, we know we should do this or we should do it this way. And then I do a little bit more than that, to be fair. I do a bunch of marketing type stuff at Sentry, which is a little bit weird. My title is CPO these days, which I do not consider myself a PM whatsoever. I do not consider myself a marketer whatsoever. And actually the majority of my work is probably in the marketing bucket. And what I mean by that is like, we acquired Syntax a while back. Syntax actually reports to me. I got one thing I can't talk about. I got another thing, which is like, I got a guy that reports to me, Chad, who you talk to. All he does is open source thought leadership now, which is just marketing. And we're doing a lot of effort around like, can we push that agenda with like merchandise and donations and all this stuff? Again, all just marketing. And then I have this sort of, we'll call it engineering marketing stunt called Spotlight, which is, I honestly think it's really interesting, but it's my hack week that I've turned into a full-time project where we hired somebody to work on it, which is basically we just took Sentry and we started running a widget locally that just connects to the SDKs. And so if you're tracing your app locally or something, you can actually get that debug information, which is actually super valuable when you look at things like Next.js or these, mixed frameworks where a lot of the stuff kind of happens between the client and the server and you're never sure where, and debugging it is actually quite painful. So here and there, I have little like odd job projects, I would say, but otherwise I'm mostly involved at like this macro weird, shadowy corporate level.
Yeah, you said you're responsible for the subjective vision and strategy of the company. You use the word subjective, and then you said you get to be at the round table of opinions. I'm curious, given that you're the founder, are those often contested? If so, what's that like?
I would say I think people rightfully trust my opinion quite often, and sometimes probably too often. So I think like everything's a matter of taste. It is a matter of like, you could do two things, both are totally valid. You've got to decide which one is the thing that is more correct for you, And so as an example, one of the big things that, I'm almost exclusively responsible for at Sentry is the way we build our business, which is we are very market share focused. We have a lot of customers. And to have a lot of customers is not just build a product. It's like you have to make all these decisions along the way. It's like, no, we have to support every technology. We have to make it really cheap, like all these different things, right? And so that's a very macro subjective decision because you don't have to build a company that way. You can just go full enterprise and stuff, right? And so it's things like that. But particularly from a product vision, I'm very dialed in. Like I'm very dialed into technology still, to like who our target customers and all this stuff. And I mean, I have so many years of domain experience in Sentry, let alone just like engineering, right? And so it's just one of those things, like we're building something. It's inherently easy to understand if it's going to be useful work, all this stuff to our target customer. And I think the challenge I have at my level is I do have all this experience and it's very valuable to help people validate things, but people need to be able to quickly validate them themselves. Because basically, I mean, the only way you generally succeed over a long period of time is if sort of the machine, that is all the people in the company, can kind of independently make the decisions. And ideally, when they make those decisions, they all make the same decision, you know? And we've not quite gotten to that yet. But I also think, you know, a lesson I've gotten, and I've heard from a lot of other founders, successful founders particularly, is it doesn't fucking matter. A lot of founders are just like in the weeds, and they have to be, you know. Particularly, we get paid a lot more than other people, so it's not. It's more than acceptable that we kind of have to continue to work our ass off and be involved in a lot of things, you know, as how I think about it. But yeah, so some of it is subjective, some of it's I would say we sometimes have conflicts, but I actually think for the most part, our leadership team is fairly aligned, and historically, product's been entirely my umbrella. So generally speaking, people would not challenge me on what we're building or why we're building. And for what's worth, I don't think we've nailed a lot of stuff, but that's also a little bit different now. I hired a CTO recently, trying to hand off all of engineering and product to him. And he's great. He's phenomenal, way smarter than me, probably better with people, more empathetic, all these things, you know. But I'll still be involved at least at that macro level of like kind of the, you know, let's all talk it out, figure out which way we're going to go, and then go do it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned a couple times that Sentry is successful. You said, you know, people would call it a success at this point. What was that inflection point that led you to go like, okay, I think it's successful. People say it's successful because this is something a lot of founders struggle with. They sometimes think they're not successful, even though they're so close to some type of exit event.
Yeah.
Where does this come from?
So I think a very, very important trait of a founder is to kind of never be content. And so like, I think we announced this, I'm pretty sure. So, we passed 100 million in revenue last year, something like that. I forget exactly when, but we passed 100 million in revenue. That's a lot. Like most people by any means would say that's successful. And as soon as we did that, I'm like, okay, what's next? Mm-hmm. A billion is a new target. What would it take to build $1 billion business? And I'm like, that is a wild idea. Like I can't even reason about that. I couldn't reason about building $100 million business off of Sentry, you know, 10 years ago. But we did it. And so I think Sentry is successful by a lot of metrics, but we are not an independent company. We're not something that is necessarily easily defensible yet. But I do think an interesting measure that I've noticed more recently of success is when you have a bunch of YC startups that are now like, we are Sentry, but better or something like that. I think you've made it. I think you're good at that point. You've impacted enough people.
Yeah.
But I actually feel we still have a long ways to go because what we went from was, you know, we had this error monitoring thing, really great product market fit early on. And then we expanded that, you know, it was really good. We spent a lot of time on that. And we're still working on building more things. You have to kind of do multi-product to survive in the world. But all our competitors were small back in the day, and we did a great job competing. We are basically the only one that stands. However, all of our competitors now are much different. They're much more scary. They're companies like Datadog, you know, and we don't necessarily one-to-one compete all the time with them, but it's like the shade of gray, you know, and they're just very good at execution, you know. And to me, something like Datadog, that is a truly successful business. You know, it's much farther ahead than we are from a revenue point of view. They've managed to build lots and lots of products. They kind of have a machine that works, I guess. And I think we're close, but I don't feel like without a lot of attention to detail and a lot of like this sort of pressure and stuff that we will say reach 250 million or 500 million in revenue or sort of that next stage. And I will say the annoying thing about doing this is that bar of what it takes to become a public company seems to keep shifting along the way for arbitrary reasons. Because that was always one of my milestones. It's like, oh, can we build a public company out of this thing? Because like very few people get to do that in the world. And I'm like, that would be fucking cool, you know? And so I will say we are successful when that happens. And then I will be very content with life, you know, just right. from what I've managed to achieve, you know.
Right, but you'll still never be content, and then it's what's next after that, and it just keeps going, right?
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've established a lot of context. We've established that Sentry is successful, but this thing started as like a side project that you just built as an open source thing because you needed it. And that's what Chad told me. And I think we haven't yet published Chad's episode. I think what we'll do is we'll publish you on Monday and then Chad on Thursday in the same week, sometime in the future. In the future relative to when we're recording, of course. But let's talk about the origin of this successful thing. Let's draw a line. We've talked about where we are now, but let's go to the beginning and let's talk through the initial problem you were trying to solve. I spoke to a number of founders, right? This is founder and CEO season, and almost every founder says, hey, I felt a pain point and I recognize this isn't just my pain point. This is going to be everyone's pain point or a lot of people's pain point. And so I'm going to solve it for me and then turn it into a product or a service and sell it. What was the initial problem that you were trying to solve when you created what is now Sentry?
Yeah, I always wonder how true these statements are when people say them. So it's not like that at all for Sentry. I built lots of stuff. I built lots of open source stuff, libraries, etc. So I was very, I just like building software, frankly. And I like building software for me to make my job easier, to solve my own problems, you know. It's like 3D printers. I like 3D printing random stuff, you know.
Yeah, somebody said the best engineers are just really, really lazy people because they just find a way 100%. To automate their stuff. Yeah, okay.
It's absolutely the truth. I would not be able to challenge that by any means. So back in the day, especially early career for me, I was in the Python Django ecosystem and I built a ton of open source stuff. Basically everything I did, I was just open source. So I'm like, I needed a new form widget or something that worked with Django, open source. Or I needed a way to do 5-star ratings, open source. And so a lot of these little things here and there. And sometimes I built them because I needed them. Sometimes I built them because I thought they would be interesting or somebody asked about it. And so Sentry actually started as the latter. And so there used to be this IRC channel, which for anybody that's like a youngin', it's like the early days, I guess, Discord, open source Discord is a way to think about it. There's a Django IRC channel. And all I remember, this is so long ago, you know, it's like there was somebody on there that asked how you would I think it was how you would log exceptions to like a dashboard or something like that, something very generic. And I don't actually think I understood. I'm like, why would you do that? Just go use a log file or something. And so I whipped up this very fast snippet of code that did it. It's probably like 10 lines of code or something. It was really easy in Django. And then I think I just spent like another hour. I'm like, this is kind of interesting. I wonder what you could do. And I played around with it. And basically I ended up with this like tiny amount of code, which is the first version of it, that had a middleware, would capture those errors, would somewhat deduplicate those errors and put them in the dashboard with a counter associated with them. And I'm like, this is kind of useful. And that was it. And I just pushed it to the side. It was like open source, whatever. I'd given it to the folks, but I was still regularly involved in the community. I was always working on stuff. If people use my open source, I would go maintain it and stuff. And some people complain about this a lot these days about maintaining open source, and it's a pain in the ass, but I found it very satisfying. Granted, it is still a pain in the ass while it's satisfying, but, and so it's just one of those products that I had and I kept working on, and I couldn't tell you exactly what happened along the way, but it evolved a little bit here and there. And then at some point I joined a company called Disqus, Disqus. It doesn't really exist anymore, but it used to be like
to make the WordPress comments, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was like the comment widget on the bottom of every website.
I used it.
It was, basically everybody. It was like, at the time, it was one of the biggest sort of Django properties on the internet. And I was always fascinated with like infrastructure and scale and those kinds of problems. And so I joined that company, and this is probably 2012 or something? Long enough time ago. You know, things get fuzzy. But I joined this company, and they're using that, which was called Django DB Log at the time. They're using a bunch of my other software. My co-founder, Chris, was working there as a designer. He's actually the referral. He's like, hey, you should come check out this company. They're using a bunch of your stuff, you know? And I was in Nebraska at the time. I'm like, I got to get out of here. It's so boring. There's no tech here. And I had already had like a taste of San Francisco kind of thing. So anyway, so I joined. They're using this version of Sentry. It's not good whatsoever. And I don't even know if they were using it a lot, but first week on the job, I'm a very, very high throughput developer, which generally translates to low, I don't want to say low quality, but I will often let bugs slip through. Right. And so I'm also a big believer in CI/CD for that exact reason, because I will just ship stuff nonstop and I need automated processes to kind of keep it under control. But that first week, I did something. I don't even remember what, but I caused an outage. Took down the entire platform. It was probably like the second day on the job or something.
Wow.
And they were using a Sentry thing. And the Sentry thing was not performant whatsoever. And so it caused all these errors, and those errors got written into Sentry. And they compounded the problem. It actually made it harder to recover the web property.
Oh, no.
And so that next week, I rewrote Sentry to be much more performant. And I think that was kind of a spark. I'm like, oh, there's a reason for me to keep poking at this. And there were still a lot of other things I worked on. Some of them were tools like Sentry, where they lived in like that. I could just call it developer tools. Some of them were just general libraries. Some of them were like things to help scale applications. But I always liked building things that just like solved my own problems, and that was one of them.
Bless you.
But yeah, so it's like, I don't know, just time and place to some degree. But it wasn't like, oh, I recognize something. I'm like, oh, I'll just keep hacking on this. It's fun. We use it. I can hack on it, And it was one of those things where all my employees supported me just doing open source. I never really even had to ask permission so much. It was just like almost a given. And so I just kept poking at it. People used it. I would go to conferences, like Django conferences, hack on it more. People would use it. And I ended up building a bunch of things that were actually pretty popular at this time. But the delta between Sentry and everything else was Sentry had a clear commercialization strategy. It could be a cloud service, right? And I think that's what I think it's obvious and people know this, but they often don't think about it like very strictly, in the sense of like, you've got a really popular open source project. Doesn't mean there's any way to make money whatsoever. And nobody should assume there ever is, kind of thing, because you have to have packaging is like part of it. Like packaging is fundamental to the business. And I think we just got, we're really fortunate. And so we did that. People kind of clearly wanted it. And it was open source, so they just self-hosted. We'd ship new updates and stuff. And then, we launched a SaaS, bootstrapped it. It was great. We made it paid only, which is very different than a lot of companies these days. It's not paid only anymore, but that's mostly because we have a mountain of cash. But we made it so it's only a paid service. If you wanted to run it for free, or if you wanted it for free, rather, you just self-host it. You pick up the tab. It's okay. And I think it did really well. But I think it also did really well because it was innovative at the time. Like, it was not, here's your log file and you can just view it in a browser. It was, hey, here's your deduplicated errors, which are much more critical. And we went further because in Python, you can do some really interesting stuff with the technology. It's really cheap to do reflection, basically. And so we were able to basically say, here's a stack trace, and here's all the variables in each frame of the stack trace. And it just made it so any kind of bug you had, it was so easy to debug. Like, it was pleasant when you broke stuff at that point. And that was such a big deal. And I think that's what nailed it on product market fit for us. There are like a few of these features, but whenever I talk to new hires, I'm like, we just took errors, we stuck them in a dashboard, we deduped them, which gave you impact. We gave you all the context possible to debug that error. And then the last critical thing was just like, we sent you an email when there was a new error, which was also huge when the noise level is low, And so, and that was it. And that I would argue that is the product today that like generates like the majority of our revenue. Just that, we do a lot more. And we do it for a lot of languages now. Not all of them nearly as good as that story, to be fair. But I think, to some degree, it's just luck. You find something that has such a great market fit. It's got a way to commercialize, and it's like, I'd like to believe I could manufacture that in the future. I know a lot more now than I did then, but it's not an easy problem. So
yeah. Wow. What a journey. You mentioned I think one of the, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the biggest things that led to Sentry's success, of course, in addition to having that solid commercialization strategy and market fit, is the fact that you got to eat your own dog food at Disqus. You got to use it at Disqus, feel the pain, and then improve it. We had a discussion with Guillermo Rausch, the CEO of Vercel, who said the same thing. Like, the reason Vercel is what it is because they use Vercel. They deploy a bunch of stuff on Vercel, and that's absolutely key. Does that resonate at all?
I think it does. And I always think it's hard. I see people that build stuff in other industries. Like, I see great engineers building non-engineering products. I'm like, I have no idea how you would do that. I think you can. So what I believe is that really driven people, they will just get into the customer story very, very aggressively. And so I don't build Sentry anymore, but I will tell you, like, from a product angle, I still have like intense expertise about what is right and wrong. And it's just from like living it nonstop. And it doesn't have to be you living it yourself. So yeah, I dog food it on my project. And I'm like constantly, I'm sure half the team hates me because I do this regularly, but I'm like using it. I'm like, guys, this sucks. It doesn't work at all. That exact same thing will happen if somebody tweets at us with something that's clearly fucking broken and shouldn't be broken. I'm like, guys, it sucks. Like, come on. Like, we got to fix this, like, it's clearly not supposed to be this way. And I thrive on that negative feedback loop. And I think it's the most important thing you can have. And it's certainly easier if you can get it yourself, right? It's faster. And I think the thing I've tried to replicate from this would be my like strategy to like do this beyond just me being an expert or something, is like, can you build that little community that will be that negative feedback loop for you? That is your target audience, right? And for me, the target audience is always, it's it's obviously the customer that will pay for it. So for us, it's developers, but it's not all developers, even though we say it is. It's like a developer that wants exactly what you're building versus a developer that wants something different than what you're building, is going to give you feedback, but it's going to shape the product in this other direction, you know? And that is, I think that's hard to build, to be fair. I think getting that sort of almost design committee, whatever you want to call that, is so critical. And it's certainly easier if you can do it yourselves. It's certainly easier when you build for your peers, which was one of our goals for what it's worth. We wanted to build a company that all of our peers would use our software, you know? But I think, you know, one of the bigger mistakes, I love and hate Twitter, but I think one of the biggest mistakes people have is they don't like soak up the value of Twitter from like a product feedback. And you see the best companies in the world doing this. Like you say anything about United Airlines on the internet and they are in your DMs, you know, they understand the value of that customer interaction point, you know, and it's just such a fascinating thing to me because I've done Sentry a long time and I'm like, could I do something else? And right now I'm like, I'm going to make this whiskey thing a thing. I don't know how I make money on it or pay the bills, but I'm like, how would I get that to something that felt like it had maybe not sort of product market fit from a commercialization point of view, but product market fit from attraction. And like, I've nailed what the customers are looking for, you know? And it's such an interesting problem, but yeah, to your point, I think it is a lot easier when you can build for yourself. And that was a lot of the stuff I was doing at the time. And so even the whiskey thing, I actually, you know, I wouldn't claim I know that much about whiskey, but I like whiskey and I'm fascinated by it and stuff. And so I am it's a learning experience at the same time for me. So
yeah. So you said you joined Disqus, and this is really when Sentry sort of took off, right? Because you got to fine tune it, as it were, at the job. From Disqus, it's still an open source project. At some point, the open source project became a company, and you left Disqus. What did that look like? When did that happen? How many was it? Years into Disqus? Was it? When did that maturity come?
Yeah, and so I think Sentry had existed 1 to 2 years before I joined Disqus. And then I was there just under 3 years. It was a small team. We were probably, I think by the time I left, we were like still sub 40 people or something. We hadn't really figured out how to build a business. And to be fair, I didn't know anything at the time either about business. I think I left probably mostly because I was just like frustrated, which you get, you know, it's life. I was also like a young kid. So it's like completely different, same, but different persona, you know? And so, you know, I had joined. It already existed. I was able to refine it. I was always very conscious about this though, because like I didn't just work on random open source at companies. I worked on stuff that was useful for my job. And so Sentry, I actually spent a lot of time while I was at Disqus, like working on it in my nights and weekends. And I spent some time during the day, but I'd only ever spend time at work when it was like something that we needed out of it at work, you know? And it was super useful to us, obviously. We were big, I would actually say we were big pioneers. We were part of the story of like pushing CI/CD back in the day. And Sentry is actually key to a sort of continuous integration story because the reality is like the faster you're going, the more velocity you have, the more things are going to go wrong. And it's like, we're not going to prevent those problems, but we want to minimize the impact of those problems, right? And Sentry's part of that story. And so it was really important for us to have something like that. And it made it valuable for us. But that was like in Python, right? It wasn't the thing that like took us everywhere. And so towards the later, I think it was maybe the last year or sub-year at Disqus, I forget exactly how the conversation, there was a PM at Heroku. And all I remember is, I think he was trying to convince me to build it. He was like a PM on like, I think the marketplace thing where they had add-ons and stuff. And he was trying to convince me to build like a Sentry add-on for the marketplace. You know, I'm like, maybe. I'm like, oh, this could be interesting. We make a little bit of money on it. We'll build a cloud service. Honestly, I thought it was like, you just shipped like a manifest and then they ran it for you and it was free money. That's not how it worked. You had to build a cloud service. And so I remember probably 6-8 months before I left Disqus over Christmas, because Christmas is always this easy time to just do whatever, take time off because everybody does. I spent 2 weeks. I spun up Stripe, built sort of the meta layer that needed to happen for like, say, organizations and memberships, all this stuff, right? And I launched like this jank cloud service, you know? And what was interesting is by the time I could actually get it live on Heroku, we already had paying customers outside of Heroku. So the Heroku thing actually ended up being meaningless to the business. But it just kind of bootstrapped and spun up the same. And I'm like, oh, this is cool. And literally there's no ambition at the time. We're like, oh, beer money, you know, like in this joke of like, oh, maybe it'll make a little bit of money. And my only goal for what it's worth was I never wanted to pay out of pocket because I've always had side products and they can start eating up a lot of your cash. Like, my stupid whiskey product's probably like $200, $300, $400 a month sometimes. Like, especially if you're using these new tech, everything's a cloud service. OpenAI calls are super expensive, all these things, right?
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to just like have this, money pit. And so I wanted it to make money. So I'm like, well, it has to be a paid service. Like, didn't have to charge a lot, but it had to cover its own costs. So I feel okay about it. And so we just kind of launched that. And then, less than a year later, I just got frustrated. And I think part of it was like Disqus was really early and this is a different era of tech, to be fair. We didn't get paid nearly as much money as we do these days. And I think I'm like, I was early career. I wanted to make more money, all this stuff. And so I decided to look around at new jobs. And so joined another company, left after 3 months. I wasn't super happy. And then I ended up at Dropbox, where I also smuggled Sentry into. And I did that for just under 2 years. But that's when we built the business. Cause and it was very painful for what it's worth. It was like, I have Dropbox, which is a growing high scale company with a lot of problems. I'm effectively on call because I'm running like the developer infrastructure, which is like basically all of our CI/CD tool chain that we built. And then I have Sentry on the side, where I am the business guy, the ops guy, the engineer, the product guy, the customer support guy. And my co-founder, I think he had just had kids or something, and he just had less free time to be able to contribute now, and he's technical. He can implement user interfaces and stuff, but he's not writing like the backend systems or anything. And so it was just a lot at that point in time, but it was the point where we really grew the business into something that could become something, where we actually took it and, we gained a couple thousand customers over those 2 years or whatever, and
Wow.
generate enough revenue that we could pay our measly salaries back in the day compared to these days. And then take it from there. We had removed all risk at that point, which was what was really exciting for me.
Right. Yeah. You had your beer money and then some.
Yeah.
But you mentioned you started before it was on Heroku. You had paying customers. How did people access Sentry and pay for it if it wasn't hosted?
So it was hosted at this point because to do the Heroku thing, we had to build the cloud service, and all Heroku was a couple of REST API endpoints that would provision accounts and deprovision accounts, right? And that was like I feel like I got tricked a little bit thing, but glass is half full. Here we are. And so because we had to do that, and Stripe was and I'm sure Stripe is still dumb easy to implement these days. It was such an easy and groundbreaking concept at the time, because like PayPal was a monstrosity, so Braintree was really hard, or maybe didn't even exist. I don't even know, but it was just so easy to get Stripe billing up and running, even though it didn't even work for us fully, because we're like usage based billing, and so we had this like jank thing. We weren't charging enough money. We had all these problems with it early days, but it was all fine. It was like problems you could fix. But to get it from 0 to 1 was like that, which I think was way easier back then for what it's worth. It's a lot harder to ship sort of what I would describe as an MVP. And an MVP is not like proof that it works. An MVP is like an actual thing that a customer would pay for me, which means it cannot be just true jank, But yeah, and so, we had it up and running, and I think Heroku never actually ended up making that much money relative to everything else, which is kind of, we spent a bunch of time on it to make it function and all this, thinking it would be like a really good investment. And it
turns out it wasn't.
Ended up not being,
Yeah, to make Sentry early, this is not Sentry today. This is the early Python, open source side project that you worked on. To make it so, you said you smuggled it into Dropbox. To make it so transferable and smuggleable, you would have had to make some technical decisions that helped shape its portability and its sort of ease to spin up and integrate into these companies. What are some of those decisions that you really reflect on in early Sentry and go like, wow, that was a good decision because it's so versatile here?
So I'm a big believer in the simplest solutions to problems. I don't care about correctness by any means. In fact, I'm so far away from that I'm like, change the problem so your answer is more correct. That's like the solution to all engineering to me. So I'm very different than like your traditional academic persona. And I think we both have our strengths, but it makes me much more pragmatic for building, say, a business or a product. We lost some of this along the way. It's really hard when the product grows in complexity, but the most important thing we did back in the day was we supported any SQL adapter that Django supported. And that's all you needed to run the service. That was such a big deal. So you could run it with SQLite. Nobody did because it didn't make sense. You didn't have like sort of reliability tools, but you could run it with SQLite. And what that meant is you could develop it against SQLite, which is very fast to iterate on. It's very fast to run the tests and all these things, and that was super, super powerful. And we actually managed to maintain what was kind of this cobbled together duct tape infrastructure that allowed it to do these like shortcuts to scale through just SQL. And then eventually we layered in Redis to act as like sort of this very fast network access layer, where we do things like, we could use it for like cache and stuff, but we mostly use it so like you'd have an event come in, and these events are they're a pain to process. They're expensive, they're large, they're complicated. And then you need to write them to a SQL database, which is expensive and complicated. And if you have a lot come in at once, it's really bad. And so we'd use Redis as almost like this buffer where we had these clever, some people would tell you they hate this stuff, the code that I wrote to do this. And it had its flaws, right? But it built probably 40 million in revenue, we just throw these in Redis. We'd increment a counter in Redis. And then eventually we'd have this job that would take all the things out of Redis and write it to the database all at once to prevent like database lock contention and stuff. And we just had all these clever hacks, and it made it so when problems happened, it was kind of painful. It was hard to manage. But operationally, outside of those scenarios, it was so easy to get up and running. And friction is like one of the biggest things you've got to focus on from an adoption point of view. And so it's much harder these days. Like the biggest companies in the world run Sentry themselves and they're competent at it. That's fine. But it takes a lot of stuff to run. It's not just SQL anymore. It's SQL. It's still Redis. It's probably still Memcache, I think. It's ClickHouse. It's some kind of key value store. I think we use Bigtable or something, It's Kafka, it's Zookeeper. I don't know. It's like everything under the sun now.
Yeah.
And we're trying to like fix that, to be fair. We're trying to get it so you can at least run a portion of Sentry without, every service possible. Or at the very least, like reduce some of the services. Because I think, like, for example, we have two queues effectively. We have Kafka, which is PubSub, and we have RabbitMQ, which is traditional queuing. We can architect it so we only need one of those. And so it's just like you never do the work, when you're building a business and stuff. You're like, well, we could fix that now. We could refactor it now. But refactoring is there's never ROI in it. Like there's never a reason to do it, unless you're building something new, generally speaking. And so it's always hard to get back to that. But yeah, just keeping the tech dumb, simple, off the shelf software, nothing proprietary, which was like law, basically. It was actually annoying because like early days, I wanted nice charts, and there's this library called High Charts, and you had to pay for it. And I remember I'm like, oh yeah, I want these. And we have a little bit of money, not a lot, but I'm like, maybe they'll give me a license for like $5,000 or $10,000. Maybe I can come up with that much money. And I remember emailing them. And at some point, I think they were very confused. They didn't actually understand what I was trying to buy. I'm like, it's open source and I want to use your stuff with it, but I don't want everybody to buy a license. And I remember it looked like they were going to sell me a license, and then they got more confused. And then the price went like instantly like 10 or 100x or something. I'm like, well, we're not using that, And so we had some of those challenges back in the day where because it was open source, you had to be very thoughtful about what technology you use. I think that's even harder today for what it's worth. Like everybody just builds on top of cloud services, and like while most clouds have sort of a replica for a lot of things, the services are not one-to-one, And so I don't know what that future looks like, but it's definitely a lot more complicated to try to take that same approach.
Right. So you built Sentry, early Sentry, which was a very bare bones. It sounds like, I don't want to be offensive, but it sounds very simple. You've got SQLite, you've got Redis working as a queue. If I'm going to say back to you what I understand of early Sentry, how it was built, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong. And I think it's important to go through this exercise because listeners will probably want to piece this together as well. And if it's somewhat redundant, then the understanding is really cemented. So what you've got is you've got SQLite as your main store because it's very fast. It's probably in memory or somewhere on disk, probably on disk. And then you've got Redis serving as a queue essentially. So you put a bunch of stuff in Redis, and then you have a job that basically goes to Redis and in a safe way will persist it to your single SQLite server. Redis you could run in a distributed way, but this sounds really very basic. And was that the full early architecture? And then you mentioned deduping error messages so that you show one error message, but then you can show the amount of times as opposed to just the many error messages. There was also probably some application layer logic for that. But was that it? Was there more? What did I miss?
Yeah. So the SQLite, just so everybody's on the same page, generally speaking, people would deploy MySQL or Postgres in production, but it was all fully interchangeable. We didn't use any specific features. And otherwise, that's pretty correct. I would say a lot of the investment, so like it was very simple, but a lot of this sort of the technology, if you will, the actual complexity was in like the heuristics to do the deduplication and the data collection side of our SDKs, because like we still are effectively the only solution to collect this kind of data. In fact, like all the competitors just use our technology now. But I think that was roughly it. And, eventually we layered on more stuff, but it's like error would come in, we'd run it through this processing stuff, we'd stick it into a SQL row, we'd increment a counter, that's another SQL row, we'd stick the giant JSON blob into another SQL row. Like, and so it was just like, I'm a big fan of SQL, especially because it is so powerful, and I'm a big fan of Postgres. And you can just do so much with them, it's like, that was also like not status quo in that era, because that's the era of like MongoDB and all these column stores like coming up, and everybody like the hot new tech, which do not work for that many problems, to be clear. They're not a be-all, end-all solution, and nor is SQL, to be fair. They were much more complicated to run, and they had similar trade-offs. And so, just that simplicity, because everybody has a SQL database. So it's like, oh, you run Postgres? You already know how to run Postgres. You just plug Sentry into it, basically, Oh, you have MySQL? It works there too, And even when we made it more complex, it was the same. And so at some point we made these abstractions, these basically service abstractions. And what I mean by that, they were just interfaces in the code. They were not it wasn't like a service architecture. So we had like a key value service, right? And so all you had to do was implement an interface in Python, just a class that had a get, a set, and a delete operation. And you could plug it into anything. And so we shipped it with like a SQL one. We shipped it with, there's this database called Riak at the time, RIAK, which was great technology for its time. It was really easy to run. And then we shipped it with the Cassandra one. And I think there was an S3 one or something. But all you needed was anything that could be a key value store. And that meant companies of all shapes and sizes would just adopt this because it's Python. It's really easy to implement. And everybody had something like that. And that became like our, what we call node storage, which is our big blob store. So we'd store all the JSON payloads in there and basically index them in SQL at the time. And so every time we kind of added everything, we tried to keep that abstraction where it was kind of really easy to plug and play. And we tried to keep those interfaces very, very simple. You can't do that with everything, mind you. Like the Redis queuing stuff we did where we called it buffers. There was only one abstraction for that. It was too complicated. You could probably do it with Kafka these days, which we do now. But doing something like a pub subsystem that does batch writes is still very complicated technology to run and to build in production, even today, so.
Yeah, and I think it's a part of that barrier is also the local entry. Like, for example, with distributed queues like Kafka, you need at least 3 nodes, and you need to either virtualize them locally or have physical machine. It's just way too complicated. Distributed, yeah. I'm convinced that the developer story for local testing and development for distributed systems just isn't there yet, right? And this is probably why you could just run Redis in a container and go, but you can't do that so easily with Kafka today. And this is probably speaking to the complexity of scaling Sentry over time.
And actually on that point, one thing I have a strong belief around this that so when I joined Dropbox, we had this VMware thing, this container that you'd spin up to develop Dropbox. It was so damn complicated. They basically tried to run production on your MacBooks, and it did not work whatsoever. And I'm a big believer in that is a waste of time. There are sort of 2 philosophies. You develop against production or you don't. I'm a big believer in don't. Simplify it, make it fast, iterate, make it correct enough. But my example, I'm very proud of this moment. We switched all of our blob store out of Postgres into Riak. I never ran Riak locally. I shipped it production. It was online. The command line said it was working. I shipped a dual write mode just from code. I tested the interfaces and stuff. It worked flawlessly. No problems whatsoever. And it was because there was just a simple interface design. It was easily testable. I didn't need to test could Riak do writes to the disk. I'm that's what it's there to do. I'm either relying on it to do it or not. I don't need to test that in development. And so even when we shipped that to prod, we still used SQLite in development for those blobs and stuff. And that was such a big deal early days. And again, it's one of those things I wish we could get back to because having this fast, accurate enough local dev environment. And we did the same thing in CI for what it's worth. I think we might have tried to test Riak and CI just to make sure that the wire interfaces worked or whatever. But we never truly tested it. We never QA'd it, I guess, if you will. And again, you didn't need to, as long as you kept it simple and you didn't try to create too much complexity in what you were doing with some kind of technology. And so I'm a big believer in keep it very simple in your development environment and even your test environment. It doesn't have to mirror production. Obviously use the same tech if you can, but not at the cost of, 32 gigs of memory because you need a bunch of Java services to run for no good reason. You don't need Zookeeper locally ever. Just put a Redis abstraction in place instead. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, and hide if it's a UI developer that has to develop against some front end that depends on this, then just give them the image and say good luck, right? That's probably what I'm hearing from you. You mentioned so again, if we get the ingredients for the recipe to build early Sentry, you've got Redis, you've got SQLite or some SQL compatible database, and you've got this thing that collects and stores events. You said exceptions, and indeed it was exceptions in early days, but now I see why Sentry is moving so much into the performance and web performance monitoring space, because you basically just reuse the same tool which collects events and stores them. And the events used to be exceptions, but now it's just whatever. It's performance data from Lighthouse. Is that accurate?
That's fairly accurate. And what I would say is we're about to overhaul all of Sentry's infrastructure.
What?
And it literally is just We have a bunch of SDKs that go for the highest quality, richest data collection possible, which is actually quite complicated and controversial for us because there's like open telemetry and all this stuff. But open telemetry doesn't try to do that. It doesn't try to achieve that goal. And so we have this conflict of how to do it, but we have that, right? And so data quality is a very big deal. And then we have effectively this event engine, which is like, we suck in the events. Somehow we write them to what looks like just a log, which is a big column ClickHouse for us. But it's just imagine one big table called events, and they're all in there. And you can power anything off of that. And they're very fast engines. And so errors are one of those events. And now we don't store everything in there. Obviously, errors are these big payloads, they're crinches, they're cringe dumps, And so we still have sort of that key value node storage somewhere that stores sort of those raw events that come in. And then we have another layer that lives on top, which basically says, I have all these interesting events. Errors are kind of a status quo thing, but so I'm going to ignore them. But say I have a bunch of these traces, which represent, ICP or slow request time or something. I can now run detection heuristics on top of those and then flag occurrences of bugs, if you will, which historically for us were just those errors. But what we'll do now is we'll dedupe sort of those occurrences of bugs as errors as we would in the past. And so it'll be something like where we'll detect basically what we call an N+1 query, which is where you say in a loop, you run the same SQL query over and over. You're using it, doing it like, you're like, okay, I have my list of posts, and then every time I render a post, I'm going to fetch the category from the database, which is very inefficient, right? And so we'll just detect those, and then we'll aggregate those together. And so we're trying to kind of like generalize the technology to make it more of an open platform around this. And I think we've got a bunch of work to do, but it's actually it's quite interesting, I guess, from a technology point of view. And it's not unique by any means. Facebook does, well, parts of it are unique, I should say, but that core event engine and everything is pretty status quo in a lot of industries now. So Facebook's one of the early pioneers of this. They call it Scuba, which is just use big column store, write all the events into it, make them very fast, very searchable, And then our difference is just like, okay, more rich data, and then that like issue sort of event detection engine on top of it.
How do you make it fast and searchable?
You gotta be smarter than me. ClickHouse is just really good technology. It's the way it's structured. It's not perfect. There's some things I wish would change, and we might have to build our own or change them or something, but it's written to be very, very fast as an analytics database. And so it's just able to search across so many entities so quickly that you don't need to be, it just, as an example, here's a simplistic version. This is not totally accurate, but in SQL, Postgres, you have transactions, right? You're like, yes. I want to write all these rows at once. And if something fails, it needs to undo, right? Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure ClickHouse does not have that anywhere. And by not having any of that, you actually you have an append log. You don't need locks on rows. You don't need all this overhead to do certain things. And so all of a sudden now writes can be much faster. And it's the same thing. Those same behaviors cascade to reads. And so part of it's like the way the system's designed. Columnar stores are actually just very fast in general because you sort of select one blob of data and can scan over it. But then also because it has less features, which is a really big deal. Like you want less features, generally speaking, in technology. Yeah. It's just like, it's trade-offs, right? It's just got all these trade-offs, and it's just really good at that one particular thing. It just happens to be that one particular thing is very valuable in sort of all forms of analytics, And so if you were building Google Analytics, you would build it on ClickHouse today, You're building Sentry, you probably should build it on ClickHouse today,
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned the case for less features equals faster. And I must say, and this is maybe you said you like negative feedback, so I can give you some if you want. When I started using Sentry in 2016, 2017, something like this. It was much earlier than, today. And I used it in production for a job, and I loved it. I fell in love for all the reasons you mentioned. It was simple. I could learn about issues with my application before my users did. It was like, at the code level, we have TypeScript and static typing for this. It was like that, but at runtime, at scale. It was brilliant. And it still is brilliant, to be fair. But I went back and used Sentry this year, and there's so much new stuff, and there's so many new features. And I want to say this as respectfully as possible, but there's so much more cruft I've noticed in the user interface with all these features. Yeah. So to your point, I think less features helped me move faster, and now I do get lost in the UI sometimes.
Yeah. We get this complaint a lot, and it's super valid, and everybody should recognize this. It's a hard thing. It's hard you get bigger, you're doing a lot of things. these things kind of happen independently and they take on lives of their own. And so we have a lot of effort going on right now to like destroy everything. And I always look at this from like the sidebar. The sidebar is your gateway into complexity, right? You look at the navigation and that inherently is the complexity. And a lot of people basically ship, like you have an org chart and that looks like your navigation, right? And we recognize it, we're fixing it. But like Sentry is going to go down to basically like 3 products. It's nice. Like fundamentally, it's like we're going to have the search behavior, we're going to have the issues thing, and we're going to have some kind of dashboard thing. And that's it. You know, it doesn't. And if you actually look at it, you step back and you squint, there's just like 8 things in our sidebar are just different versions of dashboards that, to be quite honest, are not that useful. Or at least contextually, they're not that useful. Like you don't need to go look at them. What you need to do is have them embedded somewhere else when there's a certain kind of problem and have that pop up there. Like an example that we talk about a lot is we have these things called insights now, which are a bunch of dashboards. And one is for database queries, right? It's like, okay, here's, you know, the total number of times this particular kind of query is happening, like an insert query or an insert query into this table. And that's useful information. But it's generally useful when you're solving some other particular problem. And so when you can go to it and you can be like, well, we've got like, there's this n+1 query or something, right? Okay, how frequently do I need to fix that? Well, one way I'd answer if I need to fix that is by saying, is that table, like, is the sort of read throughput of that table very heavy or something? If I reduce a bunch of queries, is that actually going to help me or something? And so there's all these places where you can contextually embed information. And so the functionality is, it's valuable, but it's not always valuable. And the lesson I have from this is like, they say this thing in like social media or something with ads, you're competing for attention, you know? And I think that's true for everything. And so it's like, if you just give people all this stuff that they don't need all the time, you're competing for their attention in using your product too. And it's not, you don't want that. Your goal is to not get their attention for products they don't need. Your goal is to give them what they need right away. And so we kind of recognize this. And again, this is where the negative feedback is really important. You have to have like absolute empathy for customers. And you gotta be like, everything everybody says has a almost absolute truth to it. Now, it might not translate one-to-one to what they're saying, but there's an inherent truth that you have to say, every kind of feedback requires change. What that change is variable, but like, you tell me the product complex, something has to be done. What that is, we don't know, but let's go figure it out, you know? And so it's hard to do that, I think, especially at like a big complicated thing like Sentry, because like I can do that. I have no fear of changing everything in the product. But imagine you're like an early career PM or in a small team, you're not gonna be like, oh, you know what we should do? We should go to Cramer. We should say, what if we gut the entire UI hierarchy? Nobody's gonna say that, you know? Even if you tell them it's okay, they still won't do it. Yeah. And so it's tricky. And this is where I go back to like, you've got to like, even as a founder, you need that sort of top down constant push to be like, yes, let's do change. Let's make big sweeping changes. It's okay, you know? And so we are very much on that, and it is painful. I think we're getting there, and I think we have a plan, but there's so many moving parts. Like we're not that big even. Like we're 400 people maybe at most. You know, it's not small by any means, but it's not 4,000 people. So
I used to often get in trouble at work because I used to always bring up this idea like, hey, have we thought about just like deleting this entire category off the sidebar? And it didn't end well for me. It was like, why are you being so provocative? So I can understand people's reservations. And I agree. I think, you know, when a founder or a CEO or whoever's at the top says like, hey, let's just be destructive, that gives people some more power. So I appreciate you doing that.
You have to have it. Like otherwise, here's the worst part is if you don't have the product person that has so much power or influence at the top doing it, what you end up is these like bad decisions. It's like, well, I don't even remember what this is, but I have this memory from when I was working at a company where we had ads, impressions on our website. And so making any changes to ads was always controversial, even if it was the right change to like fix really big flaws. And it's like, well, we might lose money on that. It's like, we should lose money on that because it's a terrible thing, you know? And it's like, and we go through a lot of this. And again, you could not do that if it wasn't me pushing this, but like we deleted cookies from our website, from our public website. There's no cookie banner on Sentry because there are no cookies when you show up. And we did it because it's a shitty customer experience. Like we don't need those cookies. The tracking's not that important, you know? And you're not going to get that unless you have somebody strong-willed at the top that's willing to just make that decision and take the consequences of that decision, you know? Even if it's the best thing for the business over a long period of time. And so I don't know how you fix that, frankly. And I don't know how you know, I'm much more good at technology than people. And I don't know how you kind of get people to also sort of be empowered to fix those things either. Like you can obviously create open channels and let them communicate and give feedback, but what I find is rarely will people actually go to that level of like, what if we did this? And will it ever rarely get escalated up, kind of thing. So.
Yeah, you said something that I threw me a little bit. You said the data we get from including cookies on the front page isn't even that useful. But what? Don't you need to know like how many people are coming to your website and like hovering on the buy button and converting and like your whole sales funnel? That's driven by the website. No, is that just not important?
Here's the analogy I would give. There are some things you need. Here's an example of something you absolutely need. You spend a bunch of money on Google Ads. You need to know that the $1,000 or whatever that Google's charging you because they said did this actually had like those people come to the website. You need some kind of tracking like that. However, that does not require cookies. It does not require identifiable tracking, as in it doesn't require me tracking you. It just requires me to know that this thing came from Google, like a UTM campaign parameter or something like that. And that gives you some degree of accountability. It also gives you enough accountability to like kind of correlate, like to say, hey, Google's actually pretty good. Signups went up. We can track them a little bit. And our Google traffic inbound went up or something like that, right? It's not perfect, but also at the same time, all the complicated tracking in the world, far from perfect and so expensive to run. So you have that and you start there, but you're able to get enough. And then what I would also tell you is like in the world where I'm like, okay, if you change the text on the buy button from buy now to start free, doesn't fucking matter. Nobody cares. Like you can optimize the shit out of this, but it's a waste of time. You're better off just building something useful. And you're most importantly better off just doing the thing that is the most obvious. Like whichever one you think is better, do that one. And if you don't have an opinion, find somebody who does and have them be in charge instead. That's my fundamental belief around this. And I wrote up an essay about this a while back where we call it optimizing for taste. And it was all stemmed. I effectively banned A/B testing at Sentry because I'm like, we wasted so much time talking about these micro optimizations and they actually led to no positive outcomes. They actually led to negative outcomes because we would test stuff and you would see a metric change. Data is always a lie, mind you. So a metric can mean anything you want it to mean, but you'd see a metric change and they'd use that to defend what ended up being a bad change. And we had one scenario, for example, where we implemented something that created some complexity in the product, but it looked like if you read the metrics in a certain way, that it was causing more success. More people were setting up projects and stuff. But if you looked back at the data in history, you'd find people were setting up all these projects. Their user experience had suffered because they had a bunch of setup projects that weren't like configured or fully, they didn't need to exist. They weren't supposed to exist, but they were confused. And then it would increase churn. And that was obvious. Like when you went into the project, you're like, I'm pretty sure this is a bad idea. It makes no sense. Why would I do this? I can reason about it as a customer. Why would I do this? And that's all you had to do. You just had to stop there. You didn't need to test it. It was good enough. You just needed subjective domain experience or taste or something. And that's true in almost everything. And even more so when you think about like, can you optimize people signing up? Yes, you can. But again, they're the obvious things. Like if you have a form like 20 fields long, obviously that's friction. You can go through the flow yourself. And if you're critical, be like, here's everything that annoys me. Here's everything I wish didn't exist. Can we get rid of all of it? You don't need complicated tracking to figure that out. Now you need like a culture and a way to routinely kind of ask those things and push on those things. But again, I gotta believe, I'm sure this is not true universally for all companies, of course, but I would bet it's true way more often than people would like to believe.
In our episode with Brandon Bayer, the founder and CEO of Flight Control, he mentioned that a lot of CTOs and early startups just want to use Kubernetes because they want to use Kubernetes. They think it's cool. He said Kubernetes is like a virus, like it gets into people's minds and then spreads. And he's like, the vast majority of startups don't need to do this, and they often over-index on Kubernetes. The reason I bring this up is because what I'm hearing from you is it's not just the technical things that we sometimes tend to over-index on. It's also apparently the everyday decisions of the call to action, buy now, try free, nobody cares. How do you recognize that at Sentry? And you also said, you said something so, I'd say controversial, David. I think this is like almost clickbait. I'll put this in the thumbnail because you said data is always a lie. But I've been around tech long enough that I've seen companies like Amazon Web Services and various large companies will have like core values. And almost always, like 9 out of 10 times, a big value is be data driven. Data doesn't lie. Mm-hmm. So how do we reconcile this? And if I'm assuming this is not a core value at Sentry, because as you said, you can make data say what you want it to say. So yeah.
So I think 2 things. So on the complexity, I'm a first principles thinker. I think that's really important. People do stuff because it's stuff they've done before.
Right.
I don't like doing things. In fact, I'm the opposite. I'm like, how do I avoid everything? Oh, if we just buy this tool, something will happen. I'm like, what's going to happen? I can reason through the whole journey of that. I don't see an outcome. Convince me of that outcome kind of thing. And so I think it just comes like, this is how my brain works. And it's like I think it's a stereotype of certain types of engineers as well, but in a very positive way. I think it's a very valuable way to approach problems. And now that is not always efficient. I waste a lot of people's time by harassing them. I'm like, our CFO will be like, do we really have to pay taxes here? What if we just ignore this shit until another day? And he'll be, in his defense, he'll be like, we could ignore it. Here's the consequences, But I'm always trying to not do things. I'm always trying, and I want people to focus on things. And most importantly, I don't want to do anything that is not obviously correct, And that's where these things come from. It's like, if you cannot reason through why that is like a useful thing or why it's important, then just don't do it. Just like avoid work, avoid stuff that you got to maintain. And that's in everything, right? So you have that side. And that's just like status quo. It's like people always come into companies or whatever. And they're like, well, I've seen this done before. It probably works. Well, ask yourself, why would it possibly work? And if you can't come up with why, do something else instead. You've got to be able to like root cause sort of success and failure modes and stuff. So I think that's part of it. On the data side, I think this is interesting because here's why I don't like it. People say data driven. A lot of naive people translate that to making decisions based on abstract, fuzzy numbers in a database, right? You can't do that. Data, for example, data is signal. Those words mean the same in this context. Signal comes from me asking the customer what's going on. That's data. That's actually way more valuable data than our random database of analytics, What I think the mistake is, nobody should be making decisions based on what the data says, what the numbers say, right? They should be making decisions based on the synthesis of all this signal, right? What I find data, traditional analytics, because I think most people, when they say data, they actually mean like sort of those metrics and those key things you track, even though that's not what Amazon would say by any means, I'm sure. I find the most value in that is actually identifying concerns or patterns, but then you have to go root cause what's going on. The data is never going to tell you a damn thing that's useful. But most importantly, the data, you can make the data tell any story you want. And that's the flaw of using it. Like, so if you have, say, PMs can often be guilty of this. I don't think ours are. But PMs will come with some bullshit numbers and be like, hey, these numbers say this, we got to do this. And it never makes any sense. Like you could read the tarot cards a completely different way and have the same exact argument. And that's fine. You should shut down all of those arguments. It's like, and so an example of this is like, you can do the same thing with customer feedback and other signals, right? But like, we have this thing that I'm not going to name the company's name, but it's a big corporate entity that we kind of use almost as an analogy for what we don't do at Sentry. And what I mean by that is they are a company that had a lot of special use cases. It's like one customer. You bring it from sales. You've got a lot of signal that says, oh, if we build this, we'll make more money. This customer will pay more. There's probably more of them. Right? Okay, show me there's more of them. Get the actual data that says there's more. You're not going to parse the tea leaves for that. You're going to go get me 100 more customers and say, I would pay lots of money for this or something like that, right? And so I would argue, like, I think I'm allergic to the word data because it usually means this read the tea leaves thing, and I hate it because you can't parse anything useful out of just that one signal. But you need to use it from like sort of this customer feedback loop. And like you need to treat that data as much more valuable than your sort of analytics KPIs and stuff like that. And that's where I think it's a challenge. But again, I think it's similar to the Kubernetes thing. It's like, oh, this is how, you do data analytics and you buy amplitude and you track these clicks and stuff. And then you'll know if you're successful here. Like, oh, we bought an ad campaign to get JavaScript customers on Sentry, but they don't convert. So JavaScript's not our target audience. No, the onboarding sucked or something like that, right? Like it's much easier just to like go look at the problem and like, frankly, use your brain most of the time. But the data, the signal in the analytics, actually very, very important at scale to identify concerns that are otherwise very hard to pattern match against. And so again, it won't tell you what to do about it, but it will help you recognize problems and things that you might need to address. And so I don't know. It's a particularly nuanced discussion, I think. And that's my issue with it is because usually when people say it, they say it in such a generalized way that it is meaningless. And most people just adopt basic playbooks of something they've seen before. They don't reason about why they do it. They just adopt it. It'll be like, oh, we're going to adopt this methodology. We're going to track, users who show up the website and we're going to put them in the data warehouse and we're going to track signups and we're going to have conversions. And then what? What are you going to do with that?
Yeah.
Besides spend money, And that's
This
the
is
question most people don't push hard enough on.
Yeah, no, this is so cool, man. Like this is a very, very profound discussion for me because you mentioned it's nuanced, and I'm learning a ton. And I want to summarize for you what I just got out of what you just said, which is I think extremely valuable for the listeners, for any startups, especially early ones listening. It should be called like the David Cramer decision matrix or something, because like here's what I got. So the value, be data driven, tends to be too abstract because fundamentally data is a combination of both signal and noise, and we can reason about signal and noise as engineers. And what you're saying is don't mistake the signal for the noise and vice versa, because there is signal and it's important to be signal driven but not data driven, because you don't want to get some noise with that. And I think like practical examples of this I've seen in the wild. David, I've worked in developer relations for a while, and there's been instances where like we go to a conference, we have a booth, and as a condition for someone to receive a t-shirt, they have to like sign up to Sentry or whatever product we're there working on. So look at the data, look at the signal to noise here, right? You receive a bunch of signups, but it's not with happy users. It's not with people who actually want your thing. It's people who want a t-shirt. And so then you can really abuse the data. You can be like, okay, we're going to be data driven about this. Look, we went to this event. We got so many signups. It was a success. No, you went to that event and you sold a bunch of t-shirts. You don't have new, like willing users. That's a case, I think, what I'm hearing you say, where data can be abused somewhat. And so, pay attention to the signal, not the noise. I think that's a tremendous takeaway.
And I think the opposite is true too. It's like we went to this event and we're trying to collect signups, collect leads, right? Oh, we only got a few. It's clearly not worth it.
Yeah.
And nobody ever says, well, like, was that the right tool for the job? Was that the right solution? And so I don't know anything about it. Actually, that's probably not true. I probably know a lot about it these days, but I love brand marketing. And so Syntax for us is brand marketing. Like, we acquired Syntax, love the show, great reach, right? And the first thing we did, I'm like, you no longer have to sell ads. You don't even have to advertise us. Just grow the audience. I believe inherently that everything you have to be a big enough business for this to work, for what it's worth. But I believe inherently that everything is brand awareness. If you have a product that's valuable and people know about that, when they have the need for it, they will buy the product, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of, that's my entire thesis for everything, And so even conferences would be the same. Oh, we want leads. I don't care about leads. Just make sure every customer loves what we do and figure out how to solve that problem. Don't figure out how to capture the email address or paywall somebody or anything like that, Like I was just giving this feedback. We had this, some video with some like folks like Taylor Otwell and some of these other sort of senior folks. And I'm like, why is there a sign up form for it? Was my feedback to folks. And I'm sure we have reasons and stuff, whatever. But I'm like, just put it on Twitch or something. Like, get people to show up at Twitch at this time, this hour, and like one of the reasons you might want the email is to remind them. That's fine, But don't make it mandatory, because your goal is not those signups or those collecting those email addresses. Your goal is to get them to want to use Sentry and to value that content, right? And there's a balance, obviously, between how you do that. And there is value in sort of harvesting emails and stuff, obviously, because you can keep the awareness going. But I just think people over-rotate on like the tactic instead of the goal in a lot of these situations. And like as an example, one thing I'm going to do later this year is we're going to go with this big open source marketing shtick. We're going to go to conferences and we're just going to sell merch. Like literally, I'm just like, we're going to take all the Syntax stuff we're doing. We're going to go sell merch at the conference, and we do the same where we're trying to like sell t-shirts or something like that and give the money back to the projects, the open source projects. And to me, one, it's a cool thing to do, but it's also great marketing, And I'm like, let's just go do that at a conference. Like, I'll just take over our booth. We don't need lead gens. Let's just go sell t-shirts. Everybody will love it. They'll know it's us doing this. They'll like appreciate us. They'll understand our brand, which is really, really important, brand loyalty, And that's a win for me. That's a huge win. It's way more important than collecting 100 email addresses from that event, And so I just think people are not, particularly in tech, people are not bold or sort of critically thinking enough. But if you look in every other industry, especially the titans of these industries, they do all these things all the time, And that's where all my inspiration always comes. I'm like, and this is why marketing is so fascinating to me, because you see it in marketing. But I always look at these other industries. I'm like, what do they do? Can we do that? Does it apply to us? How would we do something similar to that? Because that's very cool, And liquid death is my favorite one to always talk about, because it's just water in a can, And it's like, it's wild. They make like, I don't know, it must be like $300 million a year off of water in a can at this point. And they're not first in the market or anything. They have so much competition and they're crushing it,
Yeah. Yeah, for the listeners not based in the United States, this hasn't made it across the world yet, as far as I know. Liquid Death is literally canned sparkling water that looks like a beer can with like it's got like heavy metal branding. And I think it was started because they wanted to sell a way for people who don't drink alcohol to still look cool at parties, right? And now they're competing with like Pellegrino, and they're crushing it, as you mentioned. So yeah, branding, marketing, positioning, absolutely.
Nope, but that's great. That's my lesson. Now, I'm not Liquid Death. I don't know the strategy. I don't know everything. They do talk about some of it, but I always describe it. I'm like, what Liquid Death sells is not beer. That's it. That's the brand. It's not beer, and it's like stupidity and all this stuff, and it's fun. Like we had this early campaign. And for what's worth, I find these very hard to come up with. Like, it's very hard to come up with really creative sort of marketing or just creativity in general. I find tricky, right? And we had this we wanted to do a billboard, if nothing else, because billboards are fun. And we're like, what should we put on? What's going to be the campaign, you know? And you get a bunch of like cheesy stuff like, oh, Sentry captures performance problems, just boring stuff. It's like, and if you go back to the core, marketing is just attention. Most things are just attention. You want to capture somebody's attention. So what we did is the early prototype or the campaign was Sentry can't fix this. And the concept was do something preposterous. That makes no sense. It doesn't even have to be something that's broken. It should have nothing to do with Sentry, probably nothing to do with technology. Just make it just ludicrous, you know, visually compelling and stuff. And so the first one was, it just said Sentry can't fix this. And it had a minotaur, like the horned mythical beast, playing Beat Saber. And that's it. And you're like, what the hell? Like, half the people are like, how is this marketing? But it works. It captures their attention. Half of them already know what Sentry is, so they like it. Half of them want to go look up what Sentry is because they're like confused and curious, you know? And that's the win. That's the entire goal, you know? They don't have to convert. We don't need any of that. Everything's a long play. And just people don't do that enough, you know? And there's so much of that you can do. And again, that goes back to like whether it's a podcast or something like this, you just are trying to build sort of brand recognition and tell people what your brand stands for. Like, I don't know if you could like articulate what like your brand with the podcast stands for, but like, I'm sure a lot of your listeners, they probably have some different versions of it, you know, but there's like a reason they choose to listen. And it's not, oh, because it's a tech podcast. It's like, oh, there's this thing that they kind of do or that they stand for or something like that. And that's brand, you know, and that is just such a fascinating concept to me.
This is so cool. You're actually making me think a lot more about the marketing of this podcast than I have in the past, which is really great. Because now you're having me like, instead of keep these like cookie cutter thumbnails and guest pictures that I post, just absolutely go bananas, you know? Because a lot of people will tell you, at least that's what I hope, is it's about technical deep dives, eliminating people's imposter syndrome, and really bringing engineering and its nuance to the forefront. So yeah, I guess we could think about what that would look like visualized. I want to do something cool now, like a Minotaur playing Beat Saber. I saw those ads, by the way, as I drove from SFO into downtown San Francisco. It was there, I think, if I remember correctly, some time ago. It wasn't recent. So we have discussion. This is founder and CEO season. We've had a discussion with many of them: Brandon Bayer and Glauber Costa, Monica Sarbu from Zeta, a bunch of them. And you know what's the consensus, David? Almost every founder I've talked to, every single one, mentions that yes, they're all building technically complex products. Brandon Bayer is building like flight control, which is a layer on top of AWS that makes it easier to use. Glauber is building like globally distributed SQLite at the edge, not edge compute, but at network edges at various points of presence. So like globally replicating SQLite with a level of consistency that is competitive is difficult, you know? So all of this is very complex, but every single founder says what is infinitely more complex than the engineering side of things is the marketing and positioning side of things every single time, even though they're building some really difficult, they're solving some really difficult problems. It sounds like you agree with this.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I couldn't tell you what my passion is like most days, especially these days. And I do think I love engineering. I love building stuff. It's just very fun. It's also independent, which is really nice. Like you are in control, right? But that is not the problem of most companies. It's not engineering. In fact, engineering can become the problem because it's being focused on rather, right? But it's not like the lack of engineering is not the problem, generally speaking, right? And I think what I've recognized over time, especially as a founder, and I've been at this for quite a while, you know, and I was CEO and then CTO, and now I have a fuzzy title called CPO, but I don't actually do any of that stuff. what I found over time is like there's ways that you kind of capture your interest and keep it going, and sort of what motivates you. You know, they call it burnout or whatever. I don't know if that's what it is, but I go through these waves of like, I'm like, what's going to interest me? And the thing I keep coming back to, I think honestly, is customers invigorate me. I love the feedback loop. I love like solving problems and stuff, and sort of how you know, I'm going to the same later today. I'm going to talk about storytelling. I don't know anything about storytelling. And I'm going to teach founders about storytelling, I guess. And I'm like, maybe I do, and I just don't like connect the dots.
Yeah.
But I keep going back to this, and I'm like, that aspect of marketing is basically sales. And I never want to do sales, but that aspect of talking to the customers is basically sales. And it's all these like weird things that if you got rid of all the lines of departments and stuff, they all kind of look similar. You're like, how do I get a customer a really compelling value proposition that they want? How do I get their attention and stuff? And those become almost like engineering problems that become very interesting. And I would argue they're much more important problems very quickly, at the very least, than the software is. Because like, yes, you need to get the software so it's usable and you need to validate product market fit. But half of product market fit is actually the customer side. It's getting that signal, like finding those, the ICP as they call it. That's not engineering. It's barely product. It's like, that's the entrepreneurship of it. And I find it very interesting, because I think it's very hard to do, but it's very fulfilling when you can like engage customers. Cause like what I used to do when I was early stage Sentry, I'd go to all these conferences and I'd speak at them. I never really spoke about Sentry, but I'd speak about scaling Python applications or something, or I'd speak about building an open source company because we were like a bootstrap thing at the time. But it was not like a sales pitch. It's very different. This was like organic, authentic content. I'm like, I just wanted to tell people about what I was doing. It was exciting to me, you know. That's gold marketing. You know, that's exactly what you want. And the one thing I've kept over the years, the recognition I've had is people value, from a brand even, people value authenticity. And so even I talk to a lot of founders because I do a bunch of like angel investing and stuff. And I have no filter. I will tell people the exact truth that I believe to be the truth, you know, all the time. I have no ego about it. I'm like, you want me to talk about investors? I'll tell you who I hate. I'll tell you why I think they're not going to do a damn thing for you. You know, I'll give you like my absolute truths of the world. And the people I talk to value that so much, because I don't care about like an image or opinions. I care about like, I want to be helpful. I want to solve the problem, you know, kind of thing. And that's the same again for the product, for how we talk to customers, how we get customers. And it's such an interesting thing. And I've tried to put my finger on this of like, what is my job or like kind of what motivates me and stuff, but it all kind of ends up looking very similar over and over. I just keep weirdly changing what the title is behind it or something. And I could not put a label on what it is. But I think it stems, and I think the best founders of this is like, you just really have to care about whatever you're doing, you know, not a particular problem. You have to care about anything you're doing. And, you know, you have to really be able to drive that. Like, I don't care about errors that much. It's not that interesting. In fact, it's quite boring. But I cared about being the best at it. You know, that was the motivator for me. And I cared that all of our customers liked the product. I care that nobody ever wants to say a bad thing about Sentry, that they're like, no, it's just the best product ever. And I know it's not, to be clear. And so I'm like, let me find more of those people because I really care about that. And I think that is such a big deal. And you have to do that, like, especially as a founder. But I think in everything, like, that will make you the best kind of person you can be in whatever the task is like, no, I care about this being the best it can possibly be all the time, you know?
Yeah. You know, I'm sort of like this in various areas, especially in the area of like health and fitness. I often get into debates with my partner who likes to go on walks, and I tell her that's not exercise, and she goes, "What do you mean that's not exercise?" I'm like, "Well, are you sweating?" No. So anyway, for me, I tend to be the same where I deal in extremes usually. It has to be either extremely good or it's the worst, and I'm not really comfortable with the middle. And what I'm hearing from you is that's what it takes sometimes to build really great products.
Yeah.
David, I think it's time to start wrapping up. I do have one question I would ask you. And honestly, to be fair, I could talk to you for like another 4, 5, 6 hours. I've got so many questions here, and I do want to know, but maybe we'll do a round 2 or something if you're up for it at some point. But I wanted to ask you, the context for this next question is important to establish. I was sitting with a bunch of founders some time ago, and you know, they were sort of lamenting over the idea that it's also unexpected. No one prepared them for what to do, what to expect, how to change, what a liquidation event is. Is the company overvalued? Do they raise too much capital, too little capital? There's just a lot of undefineds. And we sort of looked at, in the engineering side of the world, you've got things like HTML and JavaScript, which are living standards. They're documents that literally, like, this is what the syntax means. and it works deterministically, right? And we said, what if there was to be a specification document like that, like a living standard for the founder CEO or the first time founder or something like this, that had in it like clauses, like almost like a manifesto, like things that you should maybe expect, that you should be ready for, that is important. So I've been asking this of literally every founder and CEO on the season to get their take, and maybe we'll compile this into like a Cliff Notes or something. To give you some examples, Matt Billman, the co-founder and CEO of Netlify, he said you've got to always be able to adapt because things change pretty rapidly. And he also said, like, people are going to give you feedback about your product in its early stages, but you need to, like, kind of like you talked about, separate signal from noise. He's like, some people just can't see the vision, and so they're going to tell you it's not worth it. Don't listen to them. Like, flesh out something and like curate your feedback was what he said. Brandon Bayer mentioned marketing and positioning being an extremely difficult problem that you should be ready for. This was echoed by almost everybody. I'm curious, if you were to add to such a document, like a clause, what would you add?
Yeah. First, I want to say I agree. This would be a useful thing. There is not everybody's just kind of like thrown into this, and there is so much information and so much advice that could be given, but it's not. I think some investors are great. Our first investor helped a lot with sort of preparing me, but there's one thing. When you say this, the first thing that comes to mind, the most important lesson I ever had was one of the first things our investor told me, that this will be the loneliest job I will ever have because everything rides on you. Something has to get done, you do it, no matter what, right? And people don't get that. People start companies. You need to very seriously understand that this is, first off, this is your job forever if you succeed, right? It's not like, oh, maybe in a couple of years I'll do something else. You got to go into it with like, no, this is a long haul. I have to solve every problem. And sure, you can do that by hiring people, but it's still on you. You hired the wrong person. It's your fault. You know, you're accountable. And that is it's obvious, right, when you say it, but living it is very different than saying it, you know, and it is draining. And the problem is, my example is I hired everybody that was my friend. All my friends are my coworkers, generally speaking.
That's awesome.
And that's just how it goes. You grow up in the industry, all this stuff, right? But now, you can't actually, you have no support group of your friends kind of in a lot of these things, you know. It's great if you have a partner. My wife's doing great. Because that at least helps, but they'll still never understand what you're going through. They're just kind of like, you know, your therapist sometimes. And so I didn't really do this early days, but I do think finding like-minded people is very valuable because you need like a support network. Now, people will do it like these CEO coaches and founder coaches. I don't think they're very useful personally, but what I found interesting, like one big challenge I had is I want people that are very similar to me, that are people that are kind of in this role where they're like building organizations, but they'd rather be building software, you know? And so I tried to do this pre-COVID, and then COVID happened, where I got a bunch of people together, who were basically like VP of engineering type people, but they were basically just founders. They just like building stuff, and they happen to be in that role. Because at that point, it's like we could just run it. It's like, this is annoying, or this bothers us and stuff. And you just need that revenue, you know?
Yeah.
And I actually think that's the most important thing. You need like that support group. And I think some of these investors, especially like the more like incubator type folks, I think they give you a little bit of that, which is super, super awesome. You know, I didn't do any of those, unfortunately. But I think that's super important. And I think, you know, the other realization is or maybe not realization, but people have too much ego. You need to have like this massive amount of ego to build the thing. Like you need to be so ultra confident and ambitious in yourself. That is a must. But at the same time, you need to recognize like if you're not the person or if you're fucking up, you know. Like I think one of the best strengths Sentry had as an organization, because everybody just ruins everything over and over in an early stage startup. You just got to recognize when you've done something wrong, you'll fix it. Like just do that on repeat, you know, because like everybody's going to do something wrong, but you have to you can't be so, I guess, like arrogant almost that you can't recognize, you know, mistakes. But again, everybody makes them. And that's fine. It just is what it is. But like so many people are so stubborn, and even like late stage, like executives are so stubborn where their company is not succeeding to where it could be if they had just made different decisions. Like good example, there's a lot of companies that have kind of stalled for many, many years that are pretty big, well known, where the founder is the CEO still, and they should have just hired in better leadership instead of trying to do it themselves, because I don't know why they wanted the power, they wanted something, but it's like, it's not best for everybody. It's not best for your team, your shareholders, you know, these things. And so I think you've got to be conscious of like, don't have that ego. And like, I gave up board control when we raised our seed. I didn't give a shit. I'm like, try to fire me. I build this thing. If I'm doing a bad job, yeah, get rid of me, you know? And then I hired a CEO because I didn't want to do the job, and I just hired a CTO because I didn't really want to do that job either. I didn't want to it wasn't like, oh, I need to hold this for power. I'm like, it doesn't matter. I still have plenty of it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter to me. I'm like, it's like better for everyone if I can bring in like really strong talent that help us go, faster and better. And that's a hard problem. And now, to be clear, that's not an early stage problem necessarily either. You're not hiring these people right away. But I would also say on that front, don't hire those people right away. Just hire people that are builders that are going to ship stuff that are not, filled with ego, or want those titles and stuff. And so I honestly, I could give you like 100 lessons and stuff, and they're all unique to me, but also probably apply to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But I do think there should be more of this in the world of like this honesty of like what the challenges are, what the truths of them are, what the mistakes are. I don't think people are honest enough about mistakes, and mistakes are the most important thing you can learn from. So
yeah. In fact, they're great lessons. That's the way I see it. Every mistake is a lesson, and if you don't learn from it, you kind of wasted it. I want to go back to your first thing where you talked about it being the loneliest job ever. You mentioned you didn't have access to like the YC community and stuff when Sentry was new. What was your strategy? And the reason I'm asking is I'm trying to extract like strategies for founders who are maybe facing this now, right? How can they find that support group and have people come around them to support them?
Yeah, I think it's tough. This is one of the nice things if you have a good co-founder. And so Chris and I, we were not always like, I often took on more responsibility and stuff, and that's fine, but I could always talk to him about stuff, like at that level, it's an open book. And I'm basically friends with our first investor. He lives down the street from me in SF and stuff. And he's a great guy, really smart. I overlapped with him at Dropbox, but he's still kind of my employer. So it's a weird relationship, right? But those were helpful for me, like just adopting that. And that I would actually say from that latter point, that is one of the reasons why it's important to pick your partners, like to think about who's giving you money. Now, most investors are just bankers. They all look the same. But if you are fortunate to have a little bit more of a choice, you want somebody that's really aligned with what you want to do, that believes in your vision, versus clearly has other ideas for how to build a business or something, which is the most common version for what it's worth. I think beyond that, I don't know that I have advice. I actually think, like, we didn't do an incubator or anything like that because we just didn't need to. We had $600-700K in revenue before we raised money. We were profitable. Like, I was going to give up a bunch of equity.
So you just dealt with the loneliness. You didn't like.
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think again, I went through waves, and it's like ups and downs and stuff, and I would like find ways to keep it interesting. And I mean, I would pull, it's weird because I pull people into like an inner loop and I'll tell them things. And then I realize they're missing so much context that they're like, oh, this is weird that you're telling me this or something. But I actually don't have an answer. Even if you're in like those circles where you kind of have that support group, you still have to leverage it, right? And so I'm just not the kind of person, I'm not super outgoing about building relationships with people or anything like that. And so, and I'm sure there's a lot of people like me as well, right? But I don't really know what the answer is, but I do think great partners, great founders is that can minimize the challenges is what I would say,
right.
And so that does help immensely. Yeah. And I would say that was very valuable for me.
Yeah, what I'm hearing from you here is advice maybe not for founders, but for VCs and for other investors to have some type of founder support group. A great friend of mine, Jordan, who's a partner at a venture capital firm, is actually doing this. Like, she's creating a support group for all their portfolio companies. And I think this is so cool. About your second point, you used to be the CEO at Sentry. You gave that up. What was that like? And the reason I'm asking is, dude, I've seen this so many times. I've been in the industry now for well over a decade, maybe two. And I do see the founders stay the CEO because this is my company, and there's this enmeshment, right? The identity of the person becomes enmeshed with the identity of the corporation, and it's almost like a demotion to stop being the CEO. So I wonder if you could speak to that from your personal experience. What made you leave the position, and what was that like? What did it feel like? Did it feel like a big loss or a gain or something in between?
So I mean, you first got to start like, what is the job description of every job, right? And then if you were honest with yourself, where are you the best? Where are you the strongest person in the company? A lot of founders have too much ego. They don't ask that question. Not all founders. Yeah. You'll see many co-founders are just like a random IC in a company. That's great. Good for them. But a lot of people have that ego and they're not the best person for the job. Like, I'm not going to make myself. I think I have great marketing opinions. I'm not building a marketing organization. That is like my nightmare kind of thing. And I recognize that. It's not that hard to be humble, and so CEO, our early investor, I forget exactly what he said, but he's like, the CEO has 3 jobs. It's roughly, I think, to make sure there's enough money in the bank, to hire executives, and then there's definitely something else that I've forgotten. But making sure I have enough money in the bank, not too hard from a business point of view. I hate talking to investors. I don't ever want to talk to them again, kind of thing. There's a bunch that I like, to be fair, but I don't want to go raise money. It's easy late stage for us. It was great. Early stage, not fun. Not my thing. Didn't want to do it. I hate hiring executives. I have messed it up so many times. It's not fulfilling. It's draining. It's depressing. I'm like, oh God, it's like, I hired like 3 different marketing leaders and they just did not succeed. I had and some of them, it's like, I hired the wrong person. It's not necessarily their fault or anything. But I hired like early stage. I hired an executive, who was going to be like the business partner kind of thing. They didn't succeed. And I had to unwind all that stuff. They hired a marketing leader. They hired a sales leader, or promoted a sales leader. And it's just like, that kind of failure is draining, is what I would tell you. Right. And so if you say that's my job, is to constantly make sure the marketing leader is the best marketing leader in the world, I'm like, I don't want to do that job. That's not interesting at all. Like, I'm good at technology. I'm good at talking to customers. I have weird marketing gimmicky ideas. Let me do those things instead. And so the benefit you get as a founder is you can do any job you want, right? Founder, CEO, you just hire people to do the jobs you don't want to do. So technically you could probably stay CEO. You just have to hire these other people, but there are still going to be these non-negotiables that you must be accountable for as CEO. And the way I thought about it, and the way I would encourage everybody to think about it, is like, I told people I would do the job, because you have to be willing to do the job. This is really important. But when we raise money, I'm like, I will do the job. I will do it until there's somebody better to do the job. I don't need to do the job forever, but I'm going to do the job. And when I decided to make the change, I'm like, look, here's how it's going to work. I will hire a CEO, but only if they're like significantly better than me. I don't need a 10% optimization. I'll suck it up and do the job because it dilutes everybody. It's a risk in the company. You give up a degree of control. You don't give up. You still have plenty of influence, so it doesn't matter. But I'm like, so they have to be better. They have to be significantly better. And it was the same thing when I hired the CTO. I'm like, I need somebody that's way better than me at this job, because otherwise, what the fuck's the point? I should just I get paid plenty. I should just eat dirt and do the work. Don't complain, kind of thing. And that's how I think about it. And so when we hired the CEO, I'm just like, it was great. It was not exactly what I thought it would be, because I'm like, oh, I'm going to hire this person. Yeah, I'm still going to focus on product. They'll take all of go-to-market. I won't have to care about it ever again. I'll have way less work to do. It'll be the golden days, My workload did not really change much at all. We basically very quickly became kind of like peers, where I was still involved in a lot of the things I was involved before. They took on a lot of the workload, but at the end of the day, there's just more stuff to do. There's more stuff going around. You hire competent people and you just do more things, And that's the same with the CTO. I think it's going to be like that to some degree. But it was still great. It was still like absolutely happy with it, And no ego about it. Like I said, I still have plenty of influence. I actually get to work on more and more interesting things to me. And it's not like I'm not involved where I want to be involved in these places, but I no longer have to think about, is the sales team executing? I still worry about it, but I'm not responsible for making sure it happens, right? That's a big delta. That's a big load off your plate. For me, at least, it was, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting because you mentioned and you actually embody a lack of ego, but at the same time you said early in the startup you need a tremendous amount of ego to be so ambitious to say, hey, this is my idea, it's valuable and I believe in it. I'm gonna build this company. So it's almost, as a founder, the real superpower that you need. Let me know if this resonates. Is not to have no ego, and it's not to have a huge ego. It's to be able to turn the dial on your ego and really customize it to the situation.
Yeah, I think it's just recognizing what is best for everybody, because I have an insane amount of confidence in my abilities, right? And you could ask anybody that knows me, I'm a pain in the ass. Not only am I right too many times, just by pure chance, but I'm very direct. If you ask me about something, I will have an opinion like that. Might be the wrong opinion. I actually don't care. I'm just I'm in. Here's my opinion. Prove me wrong, kind of thing. If you don't ask me, I don't care. And so in that regard, I actually feel like I probably have a massive ego, but I'm also not I feel toxic in that, in the sense of I will make harmful decisions for people because I wrongly think I'm Superman or some dumb idea like
Yeah.
that. I just have a lot of confidence in my skills and my ability to reason and the domain signal I've developed over the years. I have absolute confidence in, kind of thing. And so I think you need that. And I think that's just an executive skill. Like I look at like TV shows, you have something with the president, and I'm sure this is actually how it works in real life half the time. You get a bunch of advisors in the room. They all say something, and like 10 seconds later, they've just made a decision based on just that. That's the signal. It's not like, let's go read all the papers and run some analytics and stuff. It's like, here's the signal we got, make a decision. I'm like, I'm good at that. Like, I will take the signal that's right there present. If nobody has any to add to it, I've got the signal I'll make it on, and I will make the decision to move on, and that's it. And that's not always good for what it's worth, but I am very decisive. It's kind of, my wife is the opposite, where she'll kind of make a decision a little bit more slowly, but then she'll go back and like, well, maybe there's another decision I can make over and over and over and over. And I'm like, I already made the decision. I don't even care about like if it was right or wrong at this point. I've moved on. If it was wrong, I'll go back and make a new decision later and fix it later, kind of thing. And I do think you need to be able to do that. You need to be able to decide something, move on, recognize if it's bad, go address it, kind of thing, but not like worry about it at the same time, And I don't know if ego is the word for all these things. Whatever it is, kind of those personality traits, I think you need a lot of them. And if you look at some of the most aggressively successful executives, not necessarily founders, but just like leaders at companies, they are like going to exhibit a lot of these things. Like I always like to talk about like Frank Slootman as an example, who ran Snowflake and then ServiceNow. And I don't think they're interesting companies particularly. That guy's really good at his job. Like, very, very good at his job. And it's not a job I could ever do. And so you got to recognize those things, again, it's not hard. It's just, you got to do it. You got to ask yourself honestly and things like that.
There was a recent piece of content published. I think it was an article that isolated a common trait among all of the top executives, as you mentioned, people like Elon Musk and Gandhi and Lincoln. So it went through history, and not just like in business, but like everywhere. What the article described as highly successful people, including Steve Jobs and all these folks, and what they sort of aggregated across these individuals was that each of them had the same core belief that even if I go bankrupt and make the wrong decision and my company's tanked, whatever, it's going to be fine. I will make a mistake and I will recover from it. You seem to embody that. Do you agree? Do you have this like deep rooted sense of like, dude, I don't care. It's going to be fine unless I'm dead. Even then, depending on your belief system, it's still going to be fine. Does that resonate?
It's weird because I think it does. Like, I'll give you my example, especially as an early adult. I was, I didn't grow up with money. I would basically just I was effectively living paycheck to paycheck, even in tech, for a long time. And I think that embodies that. That's the same fundamental thing. I'm like, it'll be fine. I'll just make more money. It's okay.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to have any issues like that. I think that one-to-one does. But at the same time, I would tell you, I feel like I'm actually pretty risk adverse. Like, I bootstrapped the company because and I didn't want to work it on full time because I'm like, well, I don't know how to raise money. Maybe that's hard. Maybe it's bad or something. I didn't want to go do that. It felt like a risk. And I wouldn't work on it full time until I could basically pay close enough to my own salary, And so I didn't want to take those risks. And that's the opposite of it. And that's actually probably one of my bigger weaknesses at the time was, you need to be willing to take risks. Now there's a balance in it, of course, but you have to be able to take risks. And so on one hand, I feel like I do because I'm like, yeah, I could probably, it's fortunate that I'm in the engineering trade. And so like engineers are highly desirable and I'm pretty functional. But I'm like, I don't know if I would be a leader in another company. I don't know if I could do that job. I also don't really care. And it's not even about the financial concern anymore because I'm probably fine, at this point. But I'm like, yeah, I could probably go get an engineering job if I needed to. It's fine. Everything's fine in the world. There's no risk there to me. I still think about it that way. But again, at the same time, then I won't take certain risks. And so I don't know. It's weird. But I would agree. You do need that. I think you need that because that is inherently you are willing to take the risks and you have to be able to take those risks. You have to be able to throw away the entire user interface of your product because it's just not good enough and start over. Like, you have to be able to do those things at every scale, every day of the week. And, if you're not, you're just not going to get anywhere in life.
Yeah.
Just,
everything plateaus. Your NGMI. All right. Last question, David. Thank you for making it this far. What's next for Sentry? You mentioned you're going to destroy everything. What's coming? Is it so as a user for me? Am I going to log into Sentry one day and find that everything's very different? Am I going to see just 3 things in my sidebar? What's next?
I think the big thing we're trying to do right now is we have a lot of stuff going on, and we have more than just sort of Sentry, the monitoring thing as well, but that's kind of what we think of as Sentry. And so within that, like our big thing from a product company point of view is we are trying to build something that can just really solve modern development problems in the sense of like most of us ship JavaScript, UIs, we're not running data centers anymore. And so we're like, how can we make these problems easier to solve that we just break software all the time or software's broken all the time, one of the two. And from Sentry's angle, it's like we do this error thing really well. However, it's no longer a good enough solution, in my opinion. We capture a bunch of data that's really useful, but we don't make it actionable, like the tracing and all this stuff. The user interface is complicated and bloated. We've got a lot of dashboards that are either don't need to exist or are in the way at the very least. And so a lot of what we're trying to do right now is like our sort of vision of the world is you have this concept of a trace, which is just a globally unique identifier. It's an ID, that you pass around. And that trace lets you link events together, right? You have the concept of tracing, which is generally the span waterfall. But so I'm not talking one-to-one here. I'm just talking about the trace ID. But we have all this data that comes into the system, and it's all connected via this trace ID, right? You have the error, you have the span waterfall, you have session replays. Pretty sure we have some other data in there somewhere. But to debug problems, you need that information just like really easily accessible. Like, you show up on Sentry, you tweet at me something's broken. I need to be able to quickly correlate what broken even means. It might not be an error, right? Like I need to be able to correlate that with you or with the symptoms. I need to be able to find that information. I need to be able to debug that problem very fast. That to me is the bread and butter of Sentry. We kind of lost that along the way. We spent a lot of time just building stuff like widgets basically. But like our core issues product or the error aggregation, it could be better. But it's still like the right kind of solution to the problem where it's like, here's the feed of all the junk that's broken, And so we're just trying to simplify what we do, but also bridge all that data together. And so likely what's next, and this is TBD, but we're likely going to open up the entire platform where you can just send us any event. I don't give a shit if you send us logs. I prefer if they have a trace ID associated with them. And we're just going to make it really easy to string together that data. So when there's a problem, it's an error, you just find the error, but then you have like the other information associated with it. So it's like my analogy these days is like, I'm using Next.js or something like that, and there's an error on the back end, but it's like triggered by the front end. The error alone is not useful enough for me anymore. I need that trace that goes with it, or the span waterfall, or maybe the session replay that goes with it. And so there's all these different like data sources that help you debug problems. And so part of it is like, we're going to do that, which is a big technology product shift, but we also just need to make it accessible because there's a lot of these like data tools in the world. And they're just like, I don't know if you've ever used like a flame graph for like profiling data, but it is not a fun technology to use. Like I've never learned how to use it effectively. And I don't want that. I don't want to like build things like that. I want to build things that are actually usable that help me solve problems where I don't have to like think about it. Just tell me what's wrong, And so what that amounts to, I don't quite know, but we're spending a lot of time thinking about how do we sort of simplify and consolidate the platform under like a few ideas instead of way too many ideas, if that makes sense. And so I think 12 months from now, there will be quite a lot of changes in the product, but we've got our work cut out for us. So
right. I think it's interesting you mentioned you just want to collect events and you don't care what kind of events they are, because this gives me the idea for, with event-sourced or event-driven systems, you've got causation ID and correlation IDs. And so you can literally like, if I send you a bunch of events that aren't even errors, just like clicks across my application, then I couldn't make sense of them in Sentry. I could literally use Sentry for a completely different use case than error aggregation and deduping, which is user behavior if I wanted to, right? It could be like they scrolled, they clicked, they hovered for 3 seconds and it's all with this trace ID or correlate ID. And I could just invent my own use case. That sounds
and that's,
pretty useful.
That's big company idea, right? Like it's like, well, we need to solve our persona and our use cases there. And we're still going to have known structured data, of course, because it's very valuable. But like, why should we limit ourselves? If we built really great technology, it's okay if people use it in ways that we didn't design it for. And to be fair, that's always been Sentry. It was errors, but I would send random log things into Sentry because I wanted to track when they were happening and how often they were happening, right? And it's okay. Like it was useful. Was it the most efficient? No, but who cares? It let me get the job done. So.
Oh, fantastic. Well, with that, David, listen, I know it's a long discussion, but I sincerely want to thank you so much for coming on. We learned so much. I mean, we learned about the early days of Sentry. We learned that it was just a side project that got adopted and you ate your own dog food at various companies and turned it into the really behemoth of a successful company that it is today. But we also talked about the technical side, the Redis and the SQLite thing to where it is now using Kafka and a lot of other distributed systems. We talked about startup culture and we talked about so much, and I'm not going to list all of them, but I just want to sincerely, on behalf of myself and all the listeners, thank you so much for coming on and adding so much value to everybody listening.
Yeah, absolutely. This was fun. Hopefully people find it useful. So
absolutely. Thank you again. Thank you for joining my discussion with David Cramer. I hope you found it as fun, frankly, as I did, and I hope you learned a ton about how a side project can go to a large business, but also about all the details in between. And particularly, I hope you enjoyed the takeaways that he had as a founder and CEO. If you're learning from and or enjoying this content, then I'd invite you to subscribe to the channel on YouTube and like the video if you can. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, then I'd invite you to leave up to a 5-star review. Really, all of this supports the podcast and makes it more discoverable. Of course, if you want to share this on social media, that'd be a huge help as well. The goal of the podcast is to make information available to everybody at scale that they can use and that they can learn from. And so if you're on board with this mission, I'd appreciate it. On behalf of myself and the guests and everyone involved, thank you for being a part of the podcast. Thank you for sticking around. And most importantly, thank you for your interest in web engineering.